To the aliens, humans were nothing but fragile creatures, until they scanned Earth and saw something terrifying. The Zorvax Empire had conquered countless worlds. Their technology was unmatched, their warriors invincible, their scientists the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. To them, humanity was just another primitive species, barely worth their attention. From their cloaked observation vessel orbiting Earth, Commander Vekler stood with his arms crossed, looking down at the planet below. His golden exosuit shimmered under the artificial lights of the control deck. Around him, a team of Zorvax scientists monitored the data streaming in from their deep planetary scans. Disappointing, Vekler muttered. Dr. Telner, a lean, pale-skinned Zorvax with piercing yellow eyes, glanced up from his monitor. Commander? Vekler waved dismissively at the holographic display before them. It showed anatomical scans of human bodies, their skeletal structures, muscle mass, and neural pathways highlighted in glowing blue. Look at them, he scoffed. Soft flesh. Weak bones. No natural armor. Compared to the warriors of our empire, they are insects. They would crumble in battle before they even realized they were at war. A chorus of laughter erupted from the Zorvax crew. I fail to see how these creatures have even survived this long, another scientist chimed in. Their lifespans are short, their healing slow. And their reliance on primitive tools? Pathetic. Dr. Telner, however, was not so quick to mock. He studied the scans carefully. Yes, humans were biologically unimpressive. But something about the data didn't sit right with him. Before he could speak, another officer turned toward Vekler. Shall I prepare a report for the High Council, Commander? Shall we classify this species as non-threatening? Vekler smirked. Without question. There is nothing here worthy of the Zorvax Empire's concern. Just as he was about to turn away, an alarm blared. The ship's sensors flickered red, and the holographic display distorted. Data flashed erratically. What is this? Vekler barked. Report. Dr. Telner's fingers flew across the console. Unidentified energy spike, Commander. It's coming from the planet. Vekler narrowed his eyes. What kind of energy? Telner hesitated. His brow furrowed. I don't know. The room fell silent. That was unheard of. The Zorvax were the most advanced species in the known galaxy, there was nothing they couldn't analyze. And yet, something on Earth defied their understanding. Run a full atmospheric scan, Vekler ordered, his voice now tense. The ship's sensors expanded their reach, scanning deep into Earth's atmosphere, detecting everything from molecular compositions to radiation signatures. The results came in instantly. And what they saw sent a wave of unease through the Zorvax crew. This cannot be, a scientist whispered. Dr. Telner's hands trembled slightly as he read the data. Commander, we were wrong. Vekler stepped forward, his jaw tightening. Explain. Telner swallowed hard before speaking. The humans, they should be weak. By all logic, they should have perished long ago. He turned to face Vekler, his expression grim. But Earth has shaped them into something else. Vekler's eyes darkened. What do you mean? Telner took a slow breath. There is something in this atmosphere. Something we don't understand. And it's not harming humans. He looked down at the screen again, voice barely above a whisper. It's making them stronger. The command deck of the Zorvax vessel was eerily quiet. The laughter and mockery had vanished, replaced by tension so thick it felt like a gravity field pressing down on them. Commander Vekler stood motionless, staring at the data on the screen. His golden exosuit, once a symbol of dominance, now felt heavy on his shoulders. This has to be an error, he muttered. Run the scan again. Dr. Telner swallowed and obeyed, fingers gliding over the control panel. The ship's sensors pulsed, scanning Earth's atmosphere once more, breaking down every molecule, measuring every radiation frequency. The results appeared instantly. "Confirmed," Telner said, his voice quieter now. "This energy signature is real." "Define it," Veckler demanded. "What is this anomaly?" Telner hesitated, then shook his head. "Unknown. It's unlike anything in our records. It's not radiation, not a natural phenomenon, and it's not artificial." He exhaled sharply. "It's just, there. Everywhere." The Zorvak's crew exchanged uneasy glances. For a race that prided itself on knowledge, the idea of an unknown force was disturbing. "How is it affecting the humans?" Veckler asked. Telner pulled up the biological scans again, comparing the findings to their initial analysis. "That's the strange part, Commander. The humans appear adapted to it." "Adapted?" Telner nodded. "Not just resistant, but thriving. It's as if their bodies have evolved to harness this force rather than be harmed by it." One of the officers scoffed. "Absurd. A species so weak it needs shelter from the elements could not possibly have evolved to resist something our own biology cannot even comprehend." Telner's gaze didn't waver. "Then explain why a Zorvak's warrior just collapsed from a simple exposure." Silence. Veckler's eyes flickered with unease. He turned sharply to a nearby officer. "Send a retrieval unit. I want that soldier brought here for examination immediately." A deadly exposure. On the lower deck of the ship, a Zorvak's warrior named Zelker lay on a medical slab, his armored body twitching. His skin, normally a smooth shade of iridescent silver, had turned a dull gray. His breathing was erratic, his eyes darting wildly, as if he were reliving a nightmare. The medical team worked frantically, but nothing was making sense. "His vitals are unstable," one of the medics barked. "His neural activity is off the charts." Dr. Telner arrived just in time to see Zelker's body seize up. The warrior let out a guttural growl, his muscles spasming violently before his breathing slowed, then stopped. A moment later, he exhaled sharply and his eyes fluttered open. "Zelker?" Telner stepped forward cautiously. Zelker's eyes, once sharp and commanding, were now filled with something the Zorvaks had never seen in their kind. Fear. His lips trembled as he struggled to speak. "They are not normal." The words came out in a rasp. His body convulsed again, as if something was inside him, crushing him from within. Then, in one final breath, he went still. Telner's blood ran cold. Zelker was dead. The warning signs. Back on the command deck, the mood had shifted from concern to outright alarm. "That's the second warrior lost to this planet," one officer growled. "What if this force is a biological weapon?" "Impossible," another argued. "Humans would have no knowledge of our existence, let alone the technology to create something like this." Telner turned to Veckler. "Commander, I believe we are dealing with something far beyond our understanding. If we remain here any longer, more of our own could suffer the same fate." Veckler's jaw clenched. He didn't like this. The Zorvak's empire never backed down. They were conquerors, feared across the stars. And yet, something about this mission felt wrong. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Telner hesitated. "We need to observe the humans closer. Not just their biology, but their behavior. We need to understand how they can survive in an environment that is seemingly toxic to us." Veckler considered this. His pride told him to leave, declare the mission pointless, and forget this anomaly ever existed. But his instincts told him something else. "Fine," he said at last. "We will stay. But we will remain in orbit, no direct contact with the planet until we know what we're dealing with." Telner nodded, relieved. I will begin analyzing human endurance data immediately. Vekler turned back to the viewing panel, watching Earth rotate beneath them. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a primitive planet with contempt. He was looking at it with unease. And deep down, a question gnawed at him. What kind of species not only survives in a deadly environment, but thrives in it? The cold silence of the Zorvak's medical bay was disturbed only by the hum of machinery. The body of Zelker, once a proud warrior, now lay lifeless, his silver skin faded to an unnatural gray. His death had shaken the crew. Zorvak's warriors did not simply die from environmental exposure. Commander Vekler stood over the body, his arms folded tightly across his armored chest. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers tapped against his wrist plate, a rare sign of unease. Dr. Tellner, on the other hand, was focused. His mind worked furiously as he studied the latest scans. There was no disease, no toxin, no known form of radiation that could explain what had happened to Zelker. And yet, the warrior was dead. There must be something we're missing, Tellner murmured. Vekler exhaled sharply. Then find it. We do not lose warriors without an explanation. Tellner motioned to a medical technician. Run a neurological scan on his brain. I want to know what he experienced in his final moments. The technician obeyed, placing a scanning device over Zelker's head. The screen flickered, data streams cascading rapidly. Tellner narrowed his eyes, analyzing the readings. Then he froze. The Zorvaks were an emotionless species by nature, logical, precise, and fearless. Their minds operated in cold efficiency, unaffected by primitive concepts like fear or panic. But Zelker's final brain activity told a different story. It was pure, undiluted terror. Tellner's breath hitched. Commander, you need to see this. Vekler stepped forward, eyes narrowing at the visualized brain scan. It played out like a nightmare. Zelker's neural patterns had spiked to unprecedented levels before his death. What is this? Vekler asked, frowning. Tellner hesitated. He wasn't in pain, Commander. He was afraid. Vekler scoffed. Impossible. No Zorvak's warrior has ever felt fear. Tellner turned back to the screen. Then explain this. The entire command deck fell silent. Fear was a concept reserved for lesser species. For warriors like Zelker, it simply did not exist. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. Something on Earth had triggered an instinct so primal, so alien to their kind, that Zelker's mind had been unable to withstand it. But what? Human endurance. Tellner knew there was only one way to find answers: study the humans directly. With Vekler's reluctant approval, he initiated a new phase of observation. The ship's scanners zoomed in on various locations across the planet. Military bases, training centers, disaster zones. Anywhere human endurance could be tested. And what they saw defied everything the Zorvaks understood about survival. They watched as soldiers ran for hours with heavy packs on their backs, sweat pouring down their faces, but refusing to stop. They saw emergency workers rushing into burning buildings, ignoring searing heat and thick smoke to save strangers. They witnessed civilians pulling themselves from beneath collapsed rubble, bleeding and broken, yet somehow, still moving forward. Tellner's hands clenched. This doesn't make sense. By all logic, they should be collapsing from exhaustion, from pain. And yet, they continue. One officer, watching a soldier crawl through mud with a shattered leg, shuddered. Why don't they stop? Another scene unfolded, a mountain climber clinging to a sheer rock face, his fingers raw and bleeding, the wind howling around him. He slipped. For a moment, it seemed he would fall to his death. But then, with nothing but sheer willpower, he forced himself upward, one agonizing movement at a time. Commander, Tellner said, his voice quiet. We've made a mistake. Vekler looked at him sharply. What are you saying? Telner exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the screen. We assumed their weakness made them insignificant. He turned to Vekler, his next words heavy. But their weakness is what makes them dangerous. A second exposure. Before Vekler could respond, another alarm blared. Another soldier down, a voice from the lower deck crackled through the comms. Telner and Vekler rushed to the medical bay, where a second Zorvax warrior lay convulsing. His body was racked with tremors, his eyes rolling back as he gasped for air. Telner moved fast, scanning him. The results were eerily similar to Zelker's. But this time, something was different. This warrior wasn't just dying. He was seeing something. His body arched violently, and then he let out a sound that sent a chill through every Zorvax in the room. A scream. Not one of pain, but of terror. Vekler took a step back, his composure wavering for the first time. Telner. Then, as suddenly as it started, the warrior fell still. His body went limp, his breathing stopped. Dead. Telner clenched his jaw. 2 warriors. 2 deaths. No wounds. No physical injuries. Just terror. Vekler turned to him, his voice lower now. What did he see? Telner didn't answer right away. He looked back at the screen showing the latest Earth footage, firefighters charging through flames, wounded soldiers refusing to fall, civilians enduring horrors beyond imagination. Then, finally, he spoke. He saw them. Vekler's face darkened. The humans? Telner nodded. Not just their bodies. Not just their endurance. He turned to Vekler with a quiet, unsettling certainty. He saw their will. The room was silent. The implications were clear. This wasn't about biology. This wasn't about strength. The Zorvax weren't dealing with a weak species. They were dealing with something far worse. A species that should break, but refuses to. A species that defies logic. A species that, against all odds, survives. Vekler's hands clenched into fists. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand something terrifying. The Zorvax weren't the hunters here. They were the prey. Commander Vekler stood at the center of the Zorvax command deck, his golden exosuit gleaming under the sterile white lights. But for the first time, that suit felt like a hollow symbol. The 2 dead warriors lay in the medical bay, lifeless, their last moments consumed by something beyond understanding. Zorvax did not fear. Zorvax did not break. Yet Earth had shattered them. The silence among the crew was suffocating. No one laughed now. No one mocked humanity. They had witnessed something impossible, a species that defied every law of survival they knew. Vekler exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. Dr. Telner. What do we know? Telner, standing at his console, was still analyzing the data, but his voice was different now. No arrogance. No dismissal. Only respect, and a trace of fear. It's not the air, he said. Not radiation. Not a pathogen. Not a poison. He turned to Vekler, his expression grim. It's something else entirely. Vekler frowned. Then explain it. Telner hesitated before continuing. The humans should not be able to endure what they do. Their bodies are weak, fragile. Their muscles are inferior to ours. Their bones break under pressure. He tapped the screen, bringing up footage from their observations. And yet, they watched as a human soldier, wounded and bleeding, dragged himself across a battlefield, refusing to surrender. Another clip showed firefighters bursting into a collapsing building, knowing full well they might not come out. Then, images of history. Wars fought under impossible odds. Prisoners of war, starved and tortured, yet standing strong. A frail, elderly man, barely able to walk, holding a sign that read, "I survived. So can you." Telner clenched his fists. "They do not stop." Vekler narrowed his eyes. "You mean their endurance?" Telner turned sharply. "No, Commander. Their willpower. Strength beyond strength." Vekler's mind reeled. It made no sense. Strength was measurable. It was something quantifiable: muscle mass, energy reserves, stamina. But this? This was something unseen. Unmeasurable. An invisible force that allowed them to push beyond limits that should have been absolute. Telner motioned to the medical scans of the dead Zorvax warriors. I reviewed their last moments. Their minds collapsed, not their bodies. Something within them could not process what they were experiencing. He pointed back to the human endurance footage. They saw this. They saw something we do not understand. Vekler frowned. What are you suggesting? Telner hesitated, then spoke carefully. The Zorvax are a superior species in every way, but we have never been tested. We have never needed to suffer. We conquer. We do not endure. He tapped the footage again. The humans? They were forged in suffering. Their entire existence has been one long test of survival. The crew listened in stunned silence. Telner's voice was quiet but firm. We assumed their weakness made them prey. But it has made them something else entirely. Vekler clenched his jaw. He didn't like this. Not one bit. But deep down, he couldn't deny the truth forming in his mind. Then tell me, Doctor, he said finally. If this is true, how do we defeat them? Telner's response was immediate. We don't. The room froze. Vekler's expression darkened. Explain yourself. Telner exhaled slowly, then faced his commander directly. You cannot defeat an enemy that does not break. Vekler's fists clenched. Every species breaks eventually. Telner's eyes flickered back to the screen, where an elderly human woman knelt at a gravestone, whispering something to the wind. She had lost everything. And yet, she was still here. He turned back to Vekler. Then tell me, Commander, why haven't they? Fear takes hold. The Zorvax ship felt different now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by an uneasy tension that crept through every corridor. The crew spoke in hushed tones. Some avoided the observation deck entirely, unwilling to look at the planet below. Even Vekler felt it. For the first time in his life, he was questioning something he had always believed to be an unshakable truth, that the Zorvax were invincible. Telner was right. They had never been tested. Their empire had expanded not because of hardship, but because of overwhelming advantage. They crushed worlds before they could resist. But humanity was different. They had suffered. They had broken. And yet, somehow, they still stood. Vekler's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. You think we should leave? Telner nodded. We have nothing to gain here, Commander. This species is not one we can control. They will resist beyond reason. Beyond logic. He paused. They will outlast us. Vekler remained silent for a long time. Then, he turned away from the viewing panel. Prepare the ship for departure. A wave of relief spread through the crew. No one objected. Telner let out a slow breath. It was the right choice. As the ship's engines hummed to life, Vekler cast one final glance at Earth. What kind of species thrives in chaos, he muttered. Telner answered without hesitation. The kind that can never be conquered. And with that, the Zorvax fled. For the first time in their empire's history. They had encountered something they feared. The Zorvax vessel moved into high orbit, its engines humming with silent urgency. Commander Veckler stood at the observation deck, arms folded, his jaw tight. The order had been given. They were leaving. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The Zorvax Empire had never retreated. Never feared. And now, here they were, fleeing from a species that shouldn't have even posed a threat. Behind him, the crew worked quietly. The usual chatter, the arrogance, the bravado, gone. Because they had all seen it. The footage. The endurance. The terrifying willpower of a species that refused to break. Dr. Tellner stepped forward, his voice careful. Commander, I have completed a final analysis of the human psychological patterns. The results are. He hesitated. Disturbing. Veckler's fingers tightened around the railing. Explain. Tellner activated the main display, bringing up charts and data streams, but his real focus was on the footage they had gathered. Humans do not operate under the same survival instincts as other species, he began. They have no natural armor, no enhanced physical abilities. Their bodies fail them constantly, yet they persist beyond reason. He played a video, a human firefighter rushing into a burning building, knowing full well he might not return. Another clip, a soldier, bleeding from multiple wounds, gritting his teeth as he dragged himself forward, refusing to stop. A final image, an old woman, frail and withered, placing flowers on a grave. She had lost everything. And yet, she was still here. Tellner's voice dropped to a whisper. They do not fight because they are strong. They fight because they refuse to surrender. And that, Commander, is something we cannot quantify. Doubt in the ranks. Veckler's stomach twisted. He turned to face his crew. And what of our own warriors? What do we know of their deaths? Tellner sighed, bringing up their medical reports. Their bodies were undamaged. But their minds, broke. They saw something they could not comprehend. He paused, then continued. Zelker did not die from exposure. He died from the realization that these creatures will never stop. The words hung heavy in the air. One officer spoke, his voice hesitant. Commander, perhaps we should warn the Empire. Veckler's eyes narrowed. Warn them of what? That the great Zorvax Empire is afraid of a species of fragile, soft-skinned beings? Silence. But Veckler saw the truth in their faces. They were afraid. For the first time in history, the Zorvax had encountered something they could not dominate. Not through force. Not through fear. And worst of all, they had no defense against it. The final test. Veckler turned back to Tellner. You believe we should leave. I believe we need proof. Tellner stiffened. Commander, we have all the proof we need. If we remain here, we may. Veckler cut him off. No. I want one final test. A direct encounter. A murmur spread through the crew. Tellner paled. That is reckless. What kind of test? Veckler's gaze was hard. We take a human. One at random. We put them in a scenario of no escape. We see how long they last. Tellner's stomach turned. He wanted to argue. To say it was a mistake. But deep down, he understood why Veckler was doing this. The Zorvax were conquerors. Their entire existence was built upon dominance. And now, that foundation had been shaken. So they had to see it for themselves. The breaking point of a human. Tellner swallowed hard. Very well. I will prepare the test. But as he turned away, he couldn't shake a terrifying thought. What if there was no breaking point? The Zorvax ship hovered silently above Earth, cloaked from human technology. The mission had changed. This was no longer an observation. This was an experiment. A human subject had been chosen. His name was Captain Daniel Harris, a decorated soldier with years of experience in high-risk combat zones. Unbeknownst to him, his life was about to become the final test for the Zorvax Empire. Commander Vekler stood at the command deck, arms crossed. "Prepare the containment chamber." Dr. Tellner, reluctant but obedient, nodded. He had argued against this, but Vekler was determined. The Zorvax needed to see what a human would do when truly broken. They believed the answer was simple: everyone breaks eventually. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The capture. On the surface, Captain Harris was returning from a late-night training exercise. He was exhausted but alert, his instincts always sharp. Then, darkness. One moment, he was walking toward his barracks. The next, he was somewhere else. When he awoke, he found himself inside a metallic chamber, the walls smooth and seamless, no doors, no windows. His military training kicked in immediately. Assess the situation. The air was breathable. The temperature controlled. But where was he? A voice echoed from above. "Do you know where you are?" Harris narrowed his eyes. He didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't human. It had a strange, almost metallic quality. "Not yet," he said cautiously. Commander Vekler observed from the control room. "Increase the gravity by 30%, he ordered. Inside the chamber, Harris felt a sudden pressure on his chest. His movements became sluggish, his breath heavier. He immediately recognized the shift. Artificial gravity. His mind raced. Who had this level of technology? The Chinese? The Russians? No. This was something else. Something off-world. "You will answer our questions," the voice continued. "Or you will suffer." Harris smirked. "Buddy, I've already suffered plenty." The breaking point? The tests continued. Oxygen levels were lowered. Harris slowed his breathing, controlling his heart rate like he'd been trained. Extreme temperatures were introduced. First unbearable heat, then freezing cold. Harris endured, his body shivering but his mind focused. Psychological pressure. The voices taunted him, whispering doubts, distorting time. Harris ignored them. Hours passed. Vekler expected him to beg. To scream. To break. Instead, Harris laughed. "Is that all you got?" he muttered through gritted teeth. Vekler's fists clenched. Increase gravity again. The chamber's weight tripled. Harris collapsed to his knees, sweat dripping down his forehead. His muscles burned, his bones ached. But still, he grinned. "You don't get it, do you?" he said weakly. "This isn't breaking me. It's making me stronger." Tellner's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Vekler. "Commander, this is futile. He won't stop." Vekler refused to believe it. Everyone stops eventually. But Tellner wasn't so sure anymore. Because something was happening. Harris was adapting. Each new challenge, each new level of suffering, he adjusted, he pushed through. He was doing something no Zorvax had ever done. He was embracing the pain. The realization. Hours turned into a full day. Harris, battered and exhausted, was still standing. His body trembled, his breath was shallow, but his eyes were still defiant. Tellner turned to Vekler. "We have our answer, Commander." Vekler's jaw clenched. "No. Increase the pressure again." "Enough." Tellner slammed his fist on the console. The room went silent. He turned to Vekler, his voice filled with something Zorvax were not supposed to feel. "If you keep pushing him, do you know what will happen?" Vekler didn't respond. Telner took a shaky breath. He won't die. He won't surrender. He will push until his body fails him. But even in death, he won't truly lose. He motioned to the screen. Because he has already beaten us. Vekler's eyes flickered to the display. Captain Harris, bruised and battered, leaned against the wall. He was smiling. Not because he was winning. But because he had known, from the very start, that he never had to. You want to know what makes humans dangerous? Harris rasped, looking up at the unseen observers. It's not strength. It's not speed. It's not intelligence. His voice was weak, but his words carried more power than any weapon. It's that we don't stop. Ever. Telner exhaled sharply. Commander. End the test. Vekler hesitated. His pride screamed at him to continue. To find the human's limits. But deep inside, he knew the truth. There were no limits. Not for them. Never for them. He turned away from the screen. His voice was low when he finally spoke. Release him. The lesson. Harris woke up back on Earth, in the same spot where he had vanished. No time had passed. No one even noticed he was gone. As if nothing had happened. But something had. Far above, the Zorvak's ship prepared to depart. Telner turned to Vekler. What shall I report to the Empire? Vekler was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke. Tell them the truth. Telner hesitated. Which truth? Vekler exhaled. That we have seen something we cannot understand. A species that should not exist. A people who should have broken, but didn't. He clenched his fists. Tell them, we were wrong. And with that, the Zorvaks fled. For the first time in their empire's history, they had encountered something they could not conquer. And it terrified them. The Zorvak's vessel moved beyond Earth's orbit, its engines burning bright as it fled into the void of space. The silence on the command deck was deafening. No one spoke. No one dared to. They had come to Earth expecting weakness. They had left fearing something they did not understand. Commander Vekler sat in his chair, staring at the observation panel, watching as Earth grew smaller in the distance. His fingers tapped absently against the metal armrest, his mind racing. Dr. Telner approached cautiously. Commander. The official report? Vekler exhaled sharply. The Empire will not believe us. Telner nodded. They will say humans are nothing. That we overestimated them. Vekler's gaze darkened. Let them. Telner hesitated, then spoke carefully. And what do you believe, Commander? Vekler turned to him. I believe we have witnessed something dangerous. Telner swallowed hard. The humans? Vekler shook his head. No. Something much worse. He leaned forward. We have seen what happens when a species refuses to accept defeat. Telner remained silent. Vekler continued, his voice low. Every species has a limit. A point at which they break. A point at which they surrender. He turned back to the screen, his expression unreadable. The humans do not have one. Telner let that thought sink in. He had watched the experiment. He had seen Captain Harris endure suffering beyond reason. And somehow, impossibly, the human had not just survived, he had won. Not through power. Not through strategy. But through sheer, unbreakable will. And that terrified the Zorvaks more than any weapon ever could. Captain Harris remembers. Back on Earth, Captain Harris sat on a bench outside his barracks, staring at the night sky. The stars were the same as they had always been. And yet, something inside him had changed. He remembered flashes of metal walls. Voices speaking in a language not of this world. The crushing weight of gravity pressing down on him. The heat. The cold. The pain. But most of all, he remembered the feeling. Someone, something, had been watching him, waiting for him to break. And yet, he hadn't. Because he couldn't. Because humans didn't know how. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You okay, Captain?" Harris looked up to see his friend, Sergeant Cole, standing nearby, hands in his pockets. Harris smirked. "Yeah. Just thinking." Cole chuckled. "You? Thinking? Now I know something's wrong." Harris shook his head, exhaling through his nose. "Ever wonder what makes us different?" Cole frowned. "Different from what?" Harris's gaze drifted back up to the stars. "Everything else." Cole followed his gaze, then shrugged. "I dunno, man. Maybe we're just too dumb to quit." Harris chuckled. "Yeah. Maybe." Deep down, though, he knew the truth. Somewhere out there, an advanced alien empire had just discovered something terrifying. That no matter what happened, no matter how hard they tried, humanity would always get back up. The lesson. As the Zorvax ship disappeared into deep space, Vekler turned to Telner one last time. "Do you know what frightens me the most?" Telner shook his head. Vekler's voice was quiet. "That one day, they will come for us." Telner's heart pounded. "And if that day comes?" Vekler exhaled slowly. "We will lose." He turned to face the stars, his golden armor reflecting the dim light. The Zorvax had faced countless enemies. Conquered countless worlds. But now, for the first time, they understood something deeper than war. Some enemies are not meant to be fought. Some enemies can never be broken. As the ship vanished into the darkness, one final thought echoed in Vekler's mind. The humans will endure. They always have. They always will.